Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections, along with the daily mains answer writing program. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to the fragmented global climate governance, the key challenges, India's role, and the way forward. Then, in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the illegal rat hole mining, the associated challenges, and the regulatory framework. Then, in the prelims pointers section, we'll have a discussion with respect to 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to the fragmented global climate governance. Over the years, what we have been observing is a growth in awareness with respect to the environmental issues. And it all started, the inception can be traced back to the year 1972. Once we had the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, popularly known as the Stockholm Conference. Since then, we have had many of the agreements, accords among different countries at the global level. But what we'll have to understand is that the outcome of these agreements, especially at the global level, it remains suboptimal. Primarily because these agreements, they lack the implementation and enforceability. And why is that so? Because the targets with respect to the mitigation of the ill effects of climate change, they are voluntary in nature. They are not binding on the parties. It is in that regard that we have a particular column which has been published in the Hindu, which says that though we may talk about big declarations and objectives in the preamble of these agreements, but what is the final result? We are not in a capacity to achieve the climate targets. If we go by the current pathways of the way we live, then definitely we are going to breach the limits which we have set, the 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So what the authors are trying to say is that we need more of a robust institutional approach where the countries themselves should abide by certain targets. In fact, there are countries like US. We have President Trump, who considers climate change as a hoax. So we need more of, it's not about that we don't have, scientific evidence with respect to the climate change. We have a lot of evidence with respect to the anthropogenic climate change. But it is the unacceptance, it is the non-willingness or the dereliction of the countries to accept that yes, there is a real climate change. Right? So it's more about what you can understand is that we have the science of climate, right? We know about the science of climate, but what is actually hampering or what is actually hindering the efforts of different countries is the politics of climate, is the politics of science with respect to the climate. Because countries are deliberately not accepting the fact that there is a real climate change. So we need more of these countries to come on board and effectively implement all the targets. Very, very important component with respect to GS3 environment. There is an illusion of progress in climate negotiations with more process and less action. Now, before I start the discussion, let's have a quick chronological summary of what all events have taken place with respect to the climate change framework. So as I said, it all started way back in the year 1972. Once we had the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, popularly known as the Stockholm Conference. And that was the one, the Stockholm Conference. And that was the one which actually led to the, coming of the importance of the environmental issues. People started recognizing that yes, environment protection is really important. Now, that was the very basis. And this was the one which led to the formation of United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. Then it was in 1988 that we led the development of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this was a joint effort, a partnership of World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. Important for the prelims. Now, IPCC is a framework which provides the scientific evidence with respect to the climate change, right? So it has really helped a lot. And it is for that reason that in the year 2007, it was given the Nobel Peace Prize. And IPCC's report, the 1990s first assessment report, that served the basis for the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So after 1998, we had the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, popularly known as United Nations Conference of environment and development, right? Now, this formed the basis of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Over here in UNFCCC, we laid the foundations of the principles of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, and also the equity part, right? So important. Later, it was recognized that we need to have certain binding targets for the developed countries. See, primarily it is the developed countries who are responsible for the ill effects of the climate change, because the other countries, the emerging economies, including India or China, or the least developing countries, they have not contributed much with respect to the ill effects of climate change. Primarily, it is these Western countries, the European countries and the US, who have led to this particular state of crisis, right? So it was way back in 1997 that we adopted the Kyoto Protocol. Now, as the name says, protocol, this was a kind of a binding framework on the developed countries. कि भाई आप लोगों को you'll have to reduce your emissions to a certain degree, and the area or the duration within which they had to basically implement was from 2008 till 2012. But again, it saw a very limited success, primarily because most of the developed countries, they did not abide by the targets. Next, we had the Conference of Parties 15, popularly known as the Copenhagen Accord. Now, the Copenhagen Accord was primarily to develop a post-Kyoto framework, that what we are going to do after that. So it basically talked about the 2 degrees Celsius target, and it also talked about the $100 billion annual fund, $100 billion annual fund by the year 2020. Again, it was seen as a diplomatic failure. Next, we talk about the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, right? Also known as the COP21. Now, what you'll have to understand is that once we talk about the Kyoto Protocol, we term the Conference of Parties with respect to the Kyoto Protocol as CMP, and with respect to the Paris Agreement as CMA. You can see it's written over here, right? CMP and CMA. Now, in the Paris Agreement, the good thing was that there was a kind of a universal participation, and almost 198 parties attended the Paris Agreement. And there were some benchmarks which were created, that we are going to abide by the nationally determined contributions, the targets set by different countries. Then there was also a talk of that we are going to take a global stock take after every 5 years. That is, after every 5 years, we'll evaluate what all things we have done with respect to mitigating the ill effects of climate change, right? Next thing was that the negative issue with respect to the Paris Agreement is that it is not binding in nature. These targets are voluntary in nature. So it depends upon the countries whether they accept it or not. If we talk about the next framework, so we have the Conference of Parties 26, which was held in 21, the Glasgow Summit. Now, in the Glasgow, what we decided was that we are going to focus upon Article 6. Article 6 talks about the carbon markets. So the rules and regulation with respect to the carbon markets were basically finalized. You also must be aware about the Panch Amrit goals, which Prime Minister talked about in the Glasgow Summit, right? Next, we had the Conference of Parties 27. Over here, the loss and damage fund was talked about for those vulnerable countries, which are more prone to the ill effects of climate change, the loss and damage fund, right? Finally, if we can talk about Conference of Parties 30, which was recently held in November 2025 in Belém, in Brazil. Now, what you have to understand is that with respect to the overall finances, see, finances are the most important basis for mitigating the ill effects of climate change. But that is not available with the countries, right? So it has remained unresolved. The adaptation funding, it's still unresolved, and there is no consensus, right? Since all these mechanisms work on the basis of consensus, there is a kind of a veto power, a negative vote, which all people have, which all countries have. So therefore, coming to a kind of a regulatory framework through which we can achieve the targets with respect to the climate change, it's very difficult, right? So this is the overall chronology. Now, what the authors are talking about is that right now with respect to these agreements are acting as procedural buses with no binding directions. They lack the direction and enforceability. Because since there is consensus involved, different countries, they kind of do not agree to the targets, and ultimately we cannot realize the objectives. And if we go by the current pathways, we will soon breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, which we have actually by ourselves decided by 2030 itself, right? No binding obligations on different countries, right? Next, what you'll have to understand is that we have politics over a planet. Means what? Different countries are not talking about the protection of the environment. They are now focusing upon their own national interests. The prime example is the US. It has come out from the International Solar Alliance. It has come out from the very important international organizations because they have a kind of an inward looking approach. And though we have the adequate scientific evidence which proves that yes, climate change is real and that is induced by the humans, the anthropogenic climate change, but they are not accepting that. Consensus-based decision making in these agreements, be it the Paris Agreement or the other agreements, it leads to a kind of a veto which different countries have. If I say I'll not abide by this, then there would be no consensus, right? So a no objective could be set. Next, we have a lot of the ambitious goals which are written in the declarations and the preamble, the very first page of these agreements. But what about the commitments? Commitments are not binding. Countries are not ready to basically follow a certain pathway. They are still, their whole economy is still based upon the fossil fuels. They are not even transitioning. See, again, for countries like India and China, it is very important that we still continue with the fossil fuels. And that's the reason in Glasgow, we basically talked about the phase down of coal. We did not accept the phase out of coal because we cannot do that, right? Almost 50% of our electricity, or in fact, even more, it is sourced from the thermal power. So what you'll have to understand is that there are certain countries who are definitely putting up efforts, transitioning to more cleaner forms of energy, including the renewable energy technologies, clean technologies. But there are some countries who are actually increasing their fossil fuel reserves, fossil fuel usage. For example, we have the US. Now, US, what it says is that since it has to maintain a dominant position with respect to the artificial intelligence, it has mandated that it should excessively or intensively use the fossil fuel sources so as to create more electricity. And that electricity can be used in the data centers, which power the different artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other things. So that is what you'll have to understand. Next, national interest is more for different countries, and this is taking a kind of a more important position. This is dominating the collective global responsibility. The collective global responsibility with respect to the mitigating the ill effects of climate change. Not just mitigating, but what all effects we already have, how to adapt those effects, the negative effects, and different markets and cooperation. This is very important. We have a kind of short-termism in our approach. We are not looking at long-term sustainability. We are just looking at the profit. And even the climate agenda, how different countries are taking decisions based upon the lobbies, the corporate lobbies. The corporate lobbies, for example, in the US, they guide the policymakers in the US. And ultimately, the policymakers of the US say that we are not going to be a part of these agreements. So ultimately, it's the market and the corporations, the big giant corporations, who basically profit a lot. So for them, long-term sustainability doesn't matter. Ultimately, it is the vulnerable. Who is most vulnerable? The people. And especially the people of poor countries. What we often talk about is SIDS, small island developing states or least developing countries, right? Now, the ordinary citizens, they are the biggest losers. Because for most people, climate change, you just ask an ordinary man that, do you believe in climate change? He'll not be even aware of that. But once we have the disasters, once the disasters take place, once you must have observed that the intensity and frequency of various climatological phenomena, be it the tropical cyclone or others, it has quite increased over the years. And this has led to greater devastations, though we might have not suffered more of casualties. But the loss in terms of property is huge, right? Climate change becomes real only when it manifests in different disasters, in the drought-like conditions, the heat waves, right? Or tropical cyclones. Intensity is increasing. Now, we have the conference of parties. According to the authors, they are just symbolic. And it is a kind of a substantive failure which we are witnessing, because they might talk about big objectives, but on ground we are witnessing no transition, right? Every conference of parties termed as a success. You must have seen that after every conference of parties, we have leaders holding hands of each other and declaring that this is a success. But what kind of success they're celebrating? That's the question. Real climate action is minimal on ground. You talk about the Kyoto Protocol. Now, in Kyoto Protocol, it was first of all limited to certain countries, the developed countries, and those countries, they even didn't follow the targets which they decided. So there was a lack of implementation with respect to Kyoto Protocol. Or let's talk about the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, we have voluntary targets in terms of the nationally determined contributions. But countries they have a free will to decide what is going to be the target. And if countries do not reach to a consensus, if countries do not abide by the targets which they themselves have set, how can we achieve the targets which we have set? Limiting the rise in the temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. That is a case in point. Conference of Party 30, it's about more promises and less progress. And what are the key challenges which we are witnessing right now with respect to these climate agreements? So the Conference of Party 30 highlighted the global mutual approach, but failed with respect to the outcomes. Now this approach, it's a Portuguese term, which talks about the bottom-up approach. It talks about that there has to be the local level engagement. People need to engage at the very local, at the very grassroots, and only then we'll be able to see the change. But that requires finances, that requires resources, that requires technology, right? The 1.5 target, 1.5 degrees Celsius target is losing the credibility. Why? Because according to the United Nations Environment Program, emissions gap report can be important for the prelims. Please pay attention. Emissions gap report published by the United Nations Environment Program. In 2024, we had almost 57 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Now, this has basically, it is one of the largest which we have had over the years. And there has been a quantum jump over the years in overall emissions. So how can we expect that we would achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target? In fact, we have many of the scientists who say that by the end of 2030s, this target, we would already breach this target. So we should rather focus upon 2 degrees Celsius. And for that, it also requires a lot of resources. Then we have climate finance, big gap and small flow. According to some research, what it says is that different countries, especially the least developed countries, or the emerging economies, they need a funding of almost 2.5 to 3 trillion dollars per year. 2.5 to 3 trillion dollars per year. But right now we have this funding to the tune of almost 350 to 450 billion dollars. So this again is minuscule as compared to 2.5 or 3 trillion dollars. And this target was also achieved after years. As I told, in COP15, Copenhagen Accord, we decided that we are going to achieve it by 2020. But very recently, we have achieved this target of crossing $100 billion per year. So this is, again, a very important point of concern. The adaptation is aspirational, not operational. Because adequate finances are not there. Adequate technology is not being given to the developing countries, which already the developed countries have. Because they want to make sure that the intellectual property is secure with respect to those technologies. Next is loss and damage. Institutional but underfunded. So you have in Conference of Parties 27, you basically institutionalize the loss and damage fund. The loss and damage fund with respect to the vulnerable countries. Those countries who are more vulnerable with respect to the ill effects of climate change. But the issue is, do you have enough funds with respect to the loss and damage? And if you have, what is the kind of process which you are involving? Which is obviously minuscule. The kind of disasters which we are witnessing in these, for example, the small island developing states or the least developing countries with respect to the ill effects of climate change, they require a lot of resources. And loss and damage fund is very minuscule. It's a very small fund in order to tackle the ill effects of climate change. Then we have technology transfer and capacity building, almost negligible. almost negligible. We have some countries in Europe, for example, Germany or other countries, who are definitely helping the others with respect to the transfer of technology. But when it comes to countries like US, it considers climate change as a hoax, right? Just transition, recognition without resources. Means what? We have, see, again, you'll have to understand, climate change, first of all, is real. We have the scientific evidence, but countries are not accepting it because it is a political issue. And there is a political will which is required to convert that into reality. So we are not witnessing the correct transitions, the just transitions which should happen, because it requires a lot of resources, right? The structural reality is that right now we have the drift, not collapse. What the authors are saying is, even though we have these issues with respect to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Parties, but still this is the only hope which we have. Because the other mechanisms, for example, the G7 or G20, or let's say the Association of Small Island States, or G77 plus China, they are not capable. They do not have adequate resources. They do not have a universal participation. So the best hope which we have is the Conference of Parties, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But there is a need to make the institutional structure more robust. That is what they're calling for, right? You can just have a look at this particular infographic. 57 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. More than we would breach 1.5 degrees Celsius target by 2030s. Vague promises, no binding action, finance and adaptation gaps. And you can see the deficit is almost to the tune of $1.3 trillion. And right now we have almost $400 billion of flow. Loss and damage fund, underfunded, limited impact with respect to these countries. Technology transfer, capacity building, it is almost minuscule, right? Now, what is India's role in this particular architecture? India as a country has played a very proactive role. It is a developing country. Even though it's a developing country, we have played a very proactive role when it comes to mitigating the ill effects of climate change and also in the adaptation aspects, right? We have had leadership in the Conference of Parties negotiations. It was India who emphasized on the principles of equity. And that was the reason that UNFCCC recognized the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. What do we mean? That we have a common responsibility with respect to mitigating the ill effects of climate change. Climate changes के effect को mitigate करने के लिए we have a common responsibility. But there has to be differentiated responsibility. Not all countries are equally responsible. Those countries who have basically developed, they use a lot of fossil fuel and they are primarily responsible for the ill effects for the current state of crisis. So they need to share more of responsibilities. For example, US or the European countries, and respective capabilities. According to the capabilities of different countries, they should be given the task. They should decide their nationally determined contributions, NDCs. NDCs क्या है? Voluntary targets with respect to the Paris Agreement. The NDCs should be decided on the basis of what? The respective capabilities of different countries. Then we have climate finance advocacy. We have been talking about, we have taken participation in a lot of the platforms, international conventions with respect to the equitable distribution of finances once it comes to mitigating the ill effects of climate change. Also the adaptation, press for predictable, scaled up and concessional finance. We are not saying that you just give us grants. You give us loans, but that should be concessional. It should have very less rate of interest, right? For different projects. For example, through the Kyoto Protocol, we had the mechanisms like clean development mechanism. You must have read about this, or joint implementation, or the emissions trading. So we will also be a part of this. We will also implement some of the projects in the country which basically transition to greener forms of energy. But for that, we require finances, right? Domestic climate actions, what we have done. We have significantly boosted the overall renewable non-fossil capacity. It has crossed the 50% benchmark, the non-fossil capacity. And we have a target that we would have non-fossil capacity of 500 gigawatts by 2030. In the Panchamrit goals, we talked about that. And we also said that we would achieve the net zero status by 2070. So you just imagine India as such a big country, a diverse country, on the way of, it's still consuming, it's still big, it's a developing country right now. We are developing different sectors of the economy, but still we have such ambitious targets. That's really worth, praising. Paris Agreement targets, the NDCs. Then we have the adaptation spending, very good data. Compared to 2016 till 2025, the overall funding with respect to the adaptation, it has crossed 150%. There has been a 150% increase in the adaptation funding from 2016 till 2025, right? Policy and institutional framework, we have come with the National Action Plan on Climate Change, different actions on we have, for example, the National Solar Mission, or with respect to the strategic Himalayan sources, right? So it's basically made up of 8 submissions. Just look, different kind of submissions which we have in NAPCC, right? Then we have the NDC implementation. We have been ambitiously implementing the different NDCs target. Then we have the market technology and measures. We have implemented the production linked incentive schemes in the green sector, in the battery, for example, battery storage systems, in the renewable energy sector. Then we have the National Green Hydrogen Mission to transition to more cleaner forms of energy, including the green hydrogen. Then we have the carbon market mechanism. There was an amendment which was done to Energy Conservation Act of 2022 in 22. So through this amendment, we have formalized the structure with respect to carbon market mechanism, how to deal with this carbon credits, right? So India is definitely working on its goals. It's more about these developed countries. It's because of the developed countries that we are seeing a kind of an hampering, a kind of an hindrance with respect to achieving the objectives of these agreements. What should be the way forward? The very first should be equity and justice. The developed countries must realize the principles of CBDR and climate justice. They should provide adequate resources and technology to the least developing countries, the SIDS, small island developing states, then scaling the climate finance. See, again, even 350 or 400 US billion dollars won't work, because the requirement is to the tune of 2.5 to 3 trillion US dollars annually. So again, it has to be scaled up. Then boosting the adaptation aid. We might focus upon the mitigation, but again, more than mitigation, what we should focus upon the adaptation, especially those vulnerable countries, right? Boosting the adaptation aid, technology transfer. So this should be followed. Technology transfer, especially to those countries which cannot afford those clean technologies and the basic technologies, even those economic or cost-effective technologies can be transferred to, for example, the African countries. So that should be done. So what the authors are saying is that we have this issue as a real issue. There is scientific evidence. But again, if you just have this notion, if you'll just play political games with respect to whether you would implement the climate objectives or not, then it's not going to lead to anywhere. And we would definitely breach these, the limits which we have set, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. And then if we do so, and if the limits are breached, that would have an irreversible impact, irreparable impact on the overall population. You must have heard about the tipping points. So we would breach the tipping points, right? Let's have a means practice question. Global climate governance is increasingly characterized by ambitious declarations but weak implementation. Ambitious declarations and weak implementation. Talk about it. Discuss the structural challenges in the current UNFCCC framework. In this context, discuss the measures taken by India to address the climate change at both domestic and international levels. You can also talk about International Solar Alliance, very important. So we have ISA, which is an international framework, and India basically pioneered this. India started this with the partnership with France, right? So again, this can be highlighted, right? Do write an answer, it's very important. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and also let us know in the comments. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, we have the issue of illegal rat hole mining. Now, we have this rat hole mining, which is primarily practiced in the states of Northeast India. And this is an illegal practice, a very crude form of mining, which is labor intensive, which do not involve any kind of scientific interventions. And most of the people who are involved in this, they're very poor people, right? In one of the case, which has recently happened in Meghalaya, almost 25 people have died. They have been killed because of a blast which occurred in a rat hole mine. Now, and many people have also been badly injured. Now, what you'll have to understand is that this practice was already declared illegal in the year 2014 by the National Green Tribunal. And this was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court in 2019. Supreme Court said that under the Mines and Minerals Development Regulation Act of 1957, we declare this particular practice as illegal. We upheld the decision which was taken by the National Green Tribunal. But according to some people over there itself in Meghalaya, what they say is that there is rampant illegal coal mining continues in many parts of Meghalaya despite the NGT ban, and numerous fatal incidents in remote areas go unreported. So there is also a nexus. There is a nexus with respect to the people, the powerful people in the local areas who are still operating these mines and involving these poor people. And there is a kind of a compulsion which poor people have because they don't have other options. We'll see what are the reasons. And therefore, in many of the cases, they succumb because since these mines are not operated in scientific way, many times what we observe is that there is a collapse and many people die. Or there is the intrusion of water, there's flooding which takes place, right? So this is a very serious public safety issue, part of GS2 and disaster management also. What is rat hole mining? It's a very primitive, crude, labor-intensive and hazardous form of coal mining, primarily practiced in the Northeast India, in the states of Assam and Meghalaya, right? So this is what you can understand. A primitive coal extraction method involving the narrow tunnels of 3 to 4 feet height, suitable only for one person to crawl into. So the person, if he or she seizes any of the danger inside, the person does not even have adequate space to come out. That is what the issue with the rat hole mining is all about. Involves digging of very small tunnels, and it is typically practiced in Northeast India. Now, what are the different ways of extraction in the rat hole mining? There are primarily two ways of extraction. The very first is the side cutting. Now, it takes place once the tunnels are developed along the hill slopes, right? Second is the box cutting, where you have the vertical shafts of almost 100 to 400 feet, and then you have the horizontal passages. Just imagine. And they are very narrow. They don't have enough space, right? They don't have enough areas over there. What are the reasons for rat hole mining, especially in these parts, in the Northeast? See, over there is poverty. There is indigence. And people do not have the productive livelihood opportunities. If people would have productive livelihood opportunities, alternative opportunities, why would they involve themselves in such risky professions, in such hazardous professions? So there is lack of employment opportunities in these areas, right? And once you have the local leaders who are involved in these practice, once they offer, that if you would, take out the coal from these areas, we would give you this much amount of money. So there is a lure of money which is there, right? Financial gain, the immediate financial gain from selling the extracted coals. Moreover, in these states, for example, especially Meghalaya, there are a lot of reserves of coal. There are coal seams, right? You can just see Meghalaya, East Jaintia Hills, West Khasi Hills. The state has almost 640 million tons of coal reserves. And that is what makes the local people to involve themselves in this as a lucrative task, right? Then we have the land ownership issues. You must understand that we have most of the people living in these areas as tribals. So the land titles are not clear. And there is a kind of a tribal ownership which is there. So you have the local leaders of the tribals who basically employ different ways and means and therefore involve the more poor people in this particular practice. Ambiguities in land titles and lack of regulation. Then coal demand. Coal is something which is in continuous demand, right? So therefore, there is a continuous involvement of people in this particular illegal rat hole mine. Continuous demand for coal sustains the practice. Now, what are the challenges associated with the rat hole mining? The very first is the safety hazards. Since the passages are very narrow, they are prone to collapse. Since you are not employing any structural foundations, you're not involving any kind of pillar, they are highly prone to collapse. Moreover, what happens is once you dig too much deep into these mines, there is the inflow or there is the ingress of water. Water tends to creep in. And once water comes in, you have, in many cases, you also have the flooding which takes place. And many people, they basically get drowned under at such depths. So that is what you'll have to understand. They're prone to collapses, trapping the miners, and there is poor ventilation. And sometimes what happens is that in these mines, you have the sudden release of methane, CH4. And then the combustion takes place. And all of a sudden you have a blast. And in this particular case also, it is the blast which has taken the life of so many people, right? Suffocation, lack of safety measures, frequent accidents, injuries, and life-threatening diseases. For example, in 2024, in Vokha, in Nagaland, almost 6 people died in a collapse. Then we had in 2018, in San, in Meghalaya, more than 25 people died because of the intrusion of water, and they drowned. They were drowned because of the water, which intruded in these mines. Then we have the environmental impact. The rat hole mining contributes to the deforestation, soil erosion, and water contamination. Why? Because we have this particular phenomena known as the acid mine drainage. You have sulfur, right? Once the coal is extracted, you also have the release of sulfur. And sulfur, once it gets mixed with the water, it increases the acidity of the water. So the water loses its quality. And once people consume that, definitely it has ill effects on the health also. High sulfur in the coal leads to acid water in the rivers. Also, once the water is used, the same water is used for the irrigation, then it also degrades the soil quality, right? Improper waste disposal, acidic runoff degrades the water quality and harms the biodiversity. In Meghalaya, we have the acid mine drainage, and also, for example, in Lukha River, right? So the water in the Lukha River has become acidic. Also in Nagaland, in Vokha and Mon districts, the soil has become very poor because of the discharge of the acidic water in the fields, right? Through the irrigation. Then we have the social issues, exploitation of child labor. Yes, according to a research by the NGO Impulse, almost 70,000 child labor. This is constitutionally prohibited, right? We have Article 24. But still we have the employment of a lot of children under the age of 14 in these mines. Next thing which you'll have to understand is that we have a lot of the immigrants, people from Nepal. And in this particular case also, we have many people from Nepal who have been killed. So people from Bangladesh, from Nepal, they also come over here. They are basically lured by these local leaders that if you would work, we'll give you this much amount of money. So that is also an issue, right? You can just see mines operating without leases, environment clearances or regulatory oversights, legal ambiguity under the 6th schedule, and laws have exploited the bypass. We'll see what are the issues with respect to that. 26,000 abandoned rat hole mine openings are still not closed. So anyone can even fall in that particular mine, right? So even if you have a children going by, so that children can fall into these mines because these are not covered, these are not protected. Banned by the National Green Tribunals, there are safety risks, environmental damage, and legal issues, right? Then let's talk about what is a regulatory framework. The regulations in India, first of all, it is illegal, was banned by the NGT in 2014, and the overall jurisdiction comes within the state government and the district administration. The Supreme Court of India in July 2019 upheld the ban, and the Supreme Court very categorically said that it is illegal under the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act of 1957. The regulation of rat hole mining in Nagaland. Now, why, especially in these states, it is a serious issue and it is a rampant issue, even though it has been declared illegal. Why it is in continuation? You'll have to understand. Once we talk about Meghalaya, now Meghalaya, it's a part of 6th schedule, right? Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, Mizoram, these 4 states. Now they have the autonomous district councils or the regional councils if multiple tribal groups are there. And they have a complete control over the land, over the resources. So once you have the central oversight, and on the other hand, you have these ADCs and RCs exercising their own power. So there is a conflict. And once there's a conflict, what ultimately happens is that we have these cases of rat hole mining which are done in a very secretive manner. And in many cases, ultimately, you have these kind of blasts which take place, and then it comes to the fore. It comes to the open that, yes, a rat hole mine was being operated over there. Similarly, we have Nagaland, for example, we have Article 371A. 371A gives the tribals of Nagaland a complete control over their resources, over their land. So we have the tribal groups over there who give the local leases in the form of SPDLs. And there are strict conditions which are imposed. But still, they are misused. And then the rat hole mining takes place in these areas. 6th schedule. Through ADCs complicating the mining. Local tribal communities own both land and minerals, limiting the oversight and enforcement of the central government or even the state government. ADC's authority to legislate, it conflicts with the central regulations under the MMDR Act of 1957, and therefore there are regulatory ambiguities. Though there are the central regulations in place, but since you have the autonomy which is provided to these areas under 6th schedule or 371A, which deals with Nagaland, So you have these cases which are in continuation. International context, there is no specific international law which directly addresses the rat hole mining. But again, this is clearly described as unsustainable practice in many of the international norms. So what we'll have to understand is that what is really needed is adequate implementation. Though you have the regulatory framework or the legal framework, but that is not being implemented rightly. And because of that, also the poverty of the people is being exploited. And once you exploit the poverty of the people, you basically lure them with money. You say that we would give you the immediate financial gains, and therefore they are in a way forced to join these professions and join these hazardous mines and work over there, right? So again, this is a very important, a very critical public safety issue. Let's have a means practice question. Red hole mining continues in parts of India despite judicial prohibitions. Discuss the challenges associated with the red hole mining and the regulatory framework governing such mining practices in India. 10 marker question, 150 words. Do write an answer to this question. Let's go to the prelims pointers section. Coming to the prelims pointers, we have the very first topic which talks about the Conference on Disarmament and the New START Treaty. Now we all know that the New START Treaty, which was between US and Russia, has been allowed to lapse, right? So now this is a very critical time, especially once we talk about the nuclear disarmament, because we have no control over these two countries. And US has basically alleged that Russia is stockpiling its own resources. It is not abiding by the regulatory framework. And it has also accused China that China should be roped in a particular framework. Whereas China is saying that we don't have the capacity or the nuclear capacity or the nuclear capability which countries like Russia and US has, right? So there are confrontations among these countries. But one thing which becomes important, especially from the perspective of the prelims, is the Conference on Disarmament and the New START Treaty. The Undersecretary of the State, with respect to the arms control, told the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, we'll see what this conference is all about, that the New START Treaty, which was allowed to lapse on Thursday, had fundamental flaws. Now, this is what the take of the US is right now. Serial Russian violations, growth of more worldwide stockpiles, and the flaws in the New START's design and implementation gives the US a clear imperative to call for a new architecture that addresses the threats of today and not that of the bygone era. Now, this is what the take of US is. He told the conference at the United Nations European headquarters in Geneva. So this is the information you get. Where are the headquarters of Conference on Disarmament? In Geneva. The expiration of New START, which restricted the US and Russia to deploy 1,550 nuclear warheads each, marks the first time in decades that the world finds itself without a treaty to curb the positioning of planet's most destructive weapons. Effectively, there is now no cap. And this is a very tough situation. It's a very serious situation. The US President Donald Trump did not accept a proposal from the Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to keep the New START's restrictions in place for another year. What Putin said that we would finalize a final agreement later, but let's extend this particular treaty for a year. But US did not accept this. President Trump did not accept this and called on Thursday for a new, improved and modernized treaty. China has already publicly rejected joining the disarmament negotiations. Now, what is this Conference on Disarmament? First of all, it comes under the Office for Disarmament Affairs. The Conference on Disarmament was recognized by the 10th Special Session on Disarmament of the United Nations General Assembly in 1978 as a single multilateral disarmament negotiating forum of the international community. It succeeded over the Geneva-based negotiating forums, including the others. The CD and its predecessors have negotiated major multilateral arms limitations and disarmament agreements, such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, a very important treaty, NPT, the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling of the Biological Weapons Treaty, Convention, and the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling of the Chemical Weapons, right? So again, Chemical Weapons Convention. Most of the important conventions with respect to the disarmament have been through the Conference on Disarmament, on the Destruction and Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. What is the very objectives? Since 1997, the CD has considered the following agenda: the cessation, stoppage of the nuclear arms race and the nuclear disarmament, prevention of nuclear war, including all related matters, prevention of an arms race in outer space, effective international arrangement to assure non-nuclear weapon states against the use or threat of the use of nuclear weapons, new types of weapons of mass destructions and new systems of such weapons, radiological weapons, comprehensive program of disarmament, transparency in armaments. The conference is comprised, this is important, can be asked in the prelims, is comprised of 65 member states, including the nuclear weapon states, and 60 other states. In addition, every year, non-member states also participate upon their request in the CD's work. The number reached to 15 in 2019, highest in 20 years. The CD adopts its rules of procedure and own agenda, taking into account the recommendations of the General Assembly and the proposals of its member states. The CD conducts its work by consensus. The Conference on Disarmament works on the basis of consensus. It's a UN body, headquarters in Geneva, right? And what are all the treaties which it has led to? Culmination of treaties. So this is what you'll have to understand, important. It reports to the General Assembly annually or more frequently as appropriate. So it is ultimately accountable to whom? The United Nations General Assembly. The Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva is the Secretary General of the Conference on Disarmament, and the person is also the personal representative of the United Nations Secretary General. Staff members of the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs Geneva branch provide substantive and secretariat support to the CD. Important. Can be asked in the prelims because it has been in the news, and UPSC has had this particular habit of asking those bodies which sometimes come in the newspaper and then fade away. So please pay attention. Let's go to the next topic. Come to the next topic. This is with respect to the ASHA workers. Now we all know that ASHA workers form the very backbone of the delivery of the public health services, the provisioning of the services. But they are not given the status of the employee. Rather, what they are given the status is that of the volunteers. And they do not get a salary. Rather, what they get is honorariums, right? So this is a very critical issue, and because of that, many of the ASHA workers have protested earlier in Kerala. Now they are protesting in West Bengal because they expected a more increase from the state's budget with respect to their the payments, but that has not been realized according to their own expectations, right? Hundreds of ASHA workers, accredited social health activists, took on the streets in Kolkata on Friday to express the dissatisfaction with the rupees 1,000 hike in their honorariums announced in the West Bengal interim budget a day earlier. Now, ASHA is a trained, accredited social health activist, is a trained female community health activist. The program was conceived and funded by the Indian National Rural Health Mission, NRHM, in an effort to promote the public health awareness amongst the local rural population and increase the utilization and accountability of the existing health systems. Selected from the community itself and accountable to it, the ASHA will be trained to work as an interface between the community and the public health system. The ASHA scheme is presently in all states except Goa. The states are mandated to employ at least one ASHA worker per 1,000 people. Remember this, can be asked in the prelims. They receive basic public health training and are equipped with a standard drug kit which allows them to deliver the first contact healthcare. They are the first point of contact once we talk about the provisioning of the health services, especially in the rural areas. They are chosen through a rigorous process of selection involving various community groups, self-help groups, Anganwadi institutions, block nodal officer, district nodal officer, and others. Now, we have the ASHA workers functions, act as a care provider at the community level, facilitating the access to healthcare, medicines, and sanitation services, raising the level of awareness with respect to the nutrition, telling the parents of the newborns that what all things should be given to the baby, advocate for the female health and hygiene standards, advocate for a health conscious behavior and approach to livelihood. So therefore you can see that such an important task is being done by these ASHA workers, but they have not been given a full-fledged employment status. In rural areas, ASHA must primarily be a woman resident of the village, married, widowed, divorced, preferably in the age group of 25 to 45 years, and literate, preferably qualified up to 10th standard, formal education up to class 8. In urban areas, ASHA must be a woman resident of a slum, vulnerable clusters, and belong to that particular vulnerable group, which have been identified by the city district health society for the selection of ASHA, and must have good communication and leadership skills. The states have been given the flexibility to relax the population norms. So these are the norms, but they are not fixed. The state government can basically relax these norms in certain cases, as well as the educational qualifications on case-to-case basis, depending upon the local conditions as far as the recruitment is concerned. An ASHA worker is primarily an honorary volunteer, but is compensated for her time in the specific situations. On average, an ASHA worker's monthly income varies from 2,000 per month to 7,000 per month. So this is very minuscule, right? In addition, she is eligible for incentives, right? Can be asked in the prelims, offered under various national health programs. She would also have income from the social marketing of certain healthcare products. For example, we have the sanitary napkins, we have the contraceptives. So there is a share which is given to them. Her work should also be designed that it is done without impinging on her main livelihood and adequate monetary compensation for the time she spends on these tasks. So it is there on the paper, but in reality, they are not paid because, and in many cases, there have been case studies that they travel a lot and almost whatever amount they're even getting, that is used for in their transportation, in their commutation, right? So again, we'll have to focus upon making sure that they have a good pay, right? And they are treated in a formal manner. A formal status is given to them so that there can be a social security net, which they have, right? They're not having pensions, and obviously they are from the vulnerable sections, right? So therefore, you need to have some kind of protection, the financial protection for these people, for the ASHA workers. I hope it is clear. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, it talks about the very important strategic Chabahar Port. What the article says is, the Union government on Friday told the parliament that it has completely paid up its commitment of 120 million US dollars for Chabahar Port well before the US sanctions waiver runs out in April 2026. So right now we have a kind of a waiver, but it would end after April 2026. Let's talk about Chabahar Port. It's a deep water port located in Iran's Sistan Baluchistan province. Look at this. So we have Iran over here, and this is Chabahar Port, very near to the Gwadar port of Pakistan, where Chinese are significantly investing, right? So this is a counter to Gwadar port, right? It is counter to Gwadar port. Why? Because we have significantly invested in Chabahar Port. It is on the Gulf of Oman at the mouth of Strait of Hormuz. Remember these locations, important. It's the only Iranian port having direct access to the Indian Ocean. It consists of two separate ports. There are two separate ports, Shahid Beheshti and Shahid Kalantari. Its geographic proximity to countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, as well as its status as a key transit center of the burgeoning International North-South Transit Corridor, INSTC, gives it potential to develop into one of the most important commercial hubs in the region. INSTC is a multimodal transportation route linking the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea via Iran and onward towards northern Europe via St. Petersburg in Russia. So see, we have a normal conventional route. Let's say if you start from the Suez Canal, you go like this, and then via the Red Sea, you enter the Suez Canal, and then you have the Mediterranean Sea and the other water bodies, and then finally you go to, crossing all these English Channel, you go to St. Petersburg. But what if we have a shorter route? That's going to be more economical, right? So if you start from here, from Mumbai, and then if you travel to Chabahar Port, and then you have, let's say, the railways or the roadways, and then ultimately through the Caspian Sea, we enter these countries, and then ultimately we go to St. Petersburg. So this is a quite economic route as compared to the traditional Suez Canal route. Next, what you'll have to understand is that it also gives the opportunity to India to basically access Pakistan, to access Afghanistan, right? Because Pakistan would never allow India to use its territory, right? So therefore, via Iran, we can access Afghanistan and we can have close contacts with Afghanistan. Not just Afghanistan, but also the other Central Asian republics, and then further to Russia. So therefore, INSTC is a very important project, and one of the very important ports with respect to INSTC is Chabahar Port. You can just see Mumbai and 72 kilometer distance between the Chabahar and Gwadar ports. This is Chabahar, and then we can have access to Afghanistan. Kandla Port in Gujarat is 550 nautical miles from Chabahar Port, while the distance between Chabahar and Mumbai is 786 nautical miles. In May 2016, India signed a tripartite agreement with Iran, Afghanistan, and to develop the Shahid Beheshti terminal. So we have developed the Shahid Beheshti terminal, not the Kalantari, right? At Chabahar. It is India's first foreign port project. The deal agreement aims to establish an international transport and transit corridor in Chabahar. So this particular port has a lot of potential. But why we are not able to do so is because of the US sanctions. We already know what is happening between the US and Iran, right? There is a regional conflict which is going on. There is internal crisis which is taking place in Iran. So because of that, we haven't been able to use this particular project to its full potential. Chabahar Port, in May 2016, India signed a tripartite agreement with Iran and Afghanistan. It's India's first foreign port project. The deal agreement aims to establish international transport and transit corridor. The construction of Chabahar Port and the construction of a rail line from Chabahar Port to Zahedan. So you can see Zahedan is over here. It's in Iran, right? Are the major highlights of the project. The idea was that the port would enable India to bypass Pakistan and access Afghanistan, ultimately to Central Asia. Moreover, the port could serve as a hub for transit trade between India, Iran, and Afghanistan and provide alternative route to the traditional Silk Road that passes through China. Now look at this. We have over here Kandla Port and over here we have the Mumbai Port. Now, if we connect this to Chabahar Port, then via the road linkage and the rail linkage, we can have access to Zahedan. Then from Zahedan, we can basically have access to Zaranj. Zaranj, it's in Afghanistan. And then we have Zaranj to Dilaram. Again, it's in Afghanistan. So we have Chabahar Port to Zahedan, 1,380. To be completed, partially completed is Zahedan to Zaranj, 200 km. Completed is Zaranj to Dilaram. So if these projects are completed within times, definitely we can utilize the full potential of these projects and have better connectivity, not just with Iran and Afghanistan, but also with Central Asian republics and also further to Russia. I hope it's clear. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the National Commission for Minorities. Now, NCM has not seen the appointment of the chairperson, the vice chairperson, and the other members for years. And this, in a way, has weakened the body, incapacitated the body. And therefore, PIL was filed, a particular public interest litigation was filed in Delhi High Court with respect to why the union government is not appointing the chairperson and the vice chairperson and the other members. In that particular regard, the Delhi High Court has basically asked the centre to submit a better affidavit on the issue of filling up of the vacancies that have left the National Commission for Minorities non-functional. What the petitioner says, this executive dereliction has rendered a vital statutory body created by an act of the Parliament for the protection and welfare of the India's notified minority communities entirely defunct and headless. So we'll see what this NCM is all about. First of all, it comes within the Ministry of Minority Affairs. The National Commission for Minorities was set up as a statutory body with the enactment of National Commission for Minorities Act 1982 by the Parliament. So it's a statutory body. The NCM Act 1992 extends to whole of India. The Act was enforced with effect from 17th May 1993 and amended on 8 September 1995 to provide for a vice chairperson in the commission. As the Act stands after the amendment in 1995, the commission now consists of what is the membership? Chairperson, vice chairperson, and 5 members. So there are total 7 members, out of whom 5 members, including the chairperson, shall be amongst the notified religious minority communities. So one thing is very important. When we look at the linguistic minorities, they are taken from the perspective of the state basis, whereas religious minorities in India are considered on national basis. In the TMA Pai verdict, the Supreme Court said to the government, recommended to the government that even religious minorities should be seen from the perspective of the state. But we have the National Commission for Minorities Act, which looks the religious minorities from the national angle. As per Section 2, Subclause C of the NCM Act, minority for the purpose of NCM Act means community notified by the central government. The functions and responsibilities of the commissions are thus related to the 6 notified minority communities based on religion, namely Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, and Jains. As per Section 9, Subclause 1 of the NCM Act, the Commission is mandated to perform the following functions. What are the functions? To evaluate the progress of development of minorities under the Union and the states, monitor the working of the safeguards provided in the Constitution and in the laws enacted by the Parliament and the state legislatures, make recommendations for the effective implementation of the safeguards for the protections of interests of minorities by central government and or the state government, look into the specific complaints regarding the deprivation of rights and safeguards of minorities and take up matters with the appropriate authorities. Cause studies to be undertaken into the problems arising out of the discrimination against the minorities and recommend measures, conduct studies, research, analysis, suggest appropriate measures in respect of minority to be undertaken by the central government or the state government, make periodical or special reports to the central government on any matter pertaining to the minorities, any other matter which may be referred to it by the central government. The Commission, while performing the duty, has all the powers of a civil court. So it's a quasi-judicial body. Remember that. Summoning, what powers it has? Summoning and enforcing the attendance of any person from any part of India, examining him on oath, requiring the discovery and production of any document, receiving the evidence on affidavits, requisitioning any public record or copy thereof, issuing commissions for the examination of witnesses and documents, any other matter which may be prescribed. So it is a quasi-judicial body because it has the powers of a civil court. Just remember, can be important for the prelims. Let's go to the last article. Coming to the last topic of today's discussion, here's a mention of Lebanon and Syria. So therefore, the mapping becomes important. Look at this. We have Syria over here, and adjoining is the Lebanon over here, right? Now, Syria has access to Mediterranean Sea. Lebanon has access to Mediterranean Sea. Israel has, but Jordan does not have. Remember, Jordan does not have access to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, let's talk about the other things. We have, for example, over here, we have the Sea of Azov, right? We have the Black Sea over here. We have this as Strait of Kerch, right? This is what the Marmara Sea is. Marmara Sea. And this is the Bosphorus Strait, right? Over here we have the Strait of Dardanelles. So this is between Sea of Marmara and Aegean Sea. This is Aegean Sea, right? So this is what you have to understand. This is Cyprus. We have over here Turkey and the other countries. Look at this. This is important. Jordan does not have access to Mediterranean Sea. This is important. It's almost, it has access to over here. It has access to Gulf of Aqaba, but not Mediterranean Sea. So just remember that. Maybe this question can be asked in the prelims. That's it from my side. I hope this session was really helpful. All the very best. Thank you so much.